I'm Alexander Mathis, and I'm the co-director of this Cajal course on modern methods for quantifying behavior. I'm also an assistant professor at EPFL, and I'm really excited to talk to you now about multi-animal pose estimation with DeepLabCut. Yesterday, we talked about using DeepLabCut for single animals, and we highlighted that it is a technique where you can train a deep neural network tailored for a specific application to track key points of interest with relatively few annotated frames. And maybe cheekily, one of DeepLabCut's mottos is, if you can see it, DeepLabCut can track it. As a field overall, we're of course interested in performing pose estimation on groups of animals in the wild or in the laboratory, as we and many others have described in this recent perspective article in Nature Communications. But performing pose estimation on multiple animals performs additional challenges. As you can see in this feeding video of a school of fish, one doesn't only need to localize the body parts of individuals, but you also need to correctly group them together to estimate the pose of individuals. So that's the spatial grouping problem. And secondarily, once one has tracked the pose of an individual, one also needs to link those poses across time in order to estimate the pose of an individual over the video. These are two major challenges, and two challenges that are much easier when one deals with only a single animal in a scene. Because of that, there are fundamentally two ways with which computer vision tackles the problem of multi-animal or multi-individual pose estimation. And those techniques, they can be characterized as either bottom-up or top-down. In top-down methods, one uses a different method, for example, a tracker or a detector, to first localize individuals and to extract a so-called bounding box around each individual. So here are the 14 different individuals from this full frame shown. And then one trains a so-called top-down pose estimation model to predict the pose of each one of those individuals in these crop scenes. This is a top-down method. Top-down methods are usually more accurate, especially when there are very few social interactions between the animals. And the alternative method is called bottom-up method. So in bottom-up methods, the algorithm first localizes all the key points simultaneously with one neural network, and then uses different methods to kind of reason which key points belong to each other and to form one animal. Like, for example, this is one individual, and this is one individual, and these 5 key points belong to each other, and so on. So these are two very broad classes of bottom-up and top-down pose estimation algorithms. And in DeepLabCut, you can use both, although we typically recommend bottom-up methods. So as I alluded to, multi-animal pose estimation poses some additional challenges in relation to single animal pose estimation. And in some sense, one could argue that in single animal pose estimation, one simply needs to detect all the body parts, and then the assembly step is not required, and the tracking step is not required, because it's clear which body parts across time belong together if there's only a single animal. Now, in the case of multiple animals, one first needs to detect the key points of interest of each one of the animals, then figure out which key points belong to each other. This is called grouping or animal assembly. And then once one has estimated the pose of all the individuals in a given frame, then one performs tracking over time in order to correctly link the poses of individuals across time. Remember that what DeepLabCut actually does for detecting key points is it predicts an image that indicates the probability density of where a particular body part is in space. And this formulation of the problem is in itself immediately amendable to tracking multiple individuals. So as we already showed in the original paper, if you train a network on a single individual, like here, and you show it a frame with multiple individuals, you can just extract multiple peaks at the output, and you will get, for example, 3 noses predicted, 3 left ears predicted, and so on. But what that doesn't give you, of course, is information about which body parts belong to each other. And in bottom-up pose estimation, this is done by predicting so-called, or predicting limbs, which indicate which body parts are linked within an individual. So the key idea here is that one lets the model not only predict key points or joints, but also limbs that connect 2 joints. And since limbs only connect body parts within an individual, those edges, those predicted edges, can then be used to assemble individuals. And I'm going to explain this in much more detail in the next slides. But that is the basic idea of multiple animal DeepLabCut. So as a reminder, DeepLabCut is a multitask deep convolutional neural network where we have a backbone, which can be picked, and for example, can by default is a ResNet, and that has 2 outputs, a so-called detection output and a local refinement output, which gives you 3 deconvolutional output layers per body part. And those 3 output layers are used to localize joints or key points of interest. The model is trained in a transfer learning fashion, where the backbone is initialized with weights pre-trained on object recognition. And then during training, we perform augmentation to make this the performance more robust. So this is the standard framework for single animal DeepLabCut. Now, in the case of multiple animals, as you can see here, for example, 2 marmosets, and here we see the predicted heat map for the right wrist. We can already see that the model is able to actually predict 2 peaks corresponding to the wrists of each one of those 2 marmosets. But of course, what we need to do multi-animal pose estimation is we need to understand that this wrist, for example, belongs to this head. And so this, as I said, is done by also predicting limbs. Technically, these are called part affinity fields. And so here you see an output that corresponds to the part affinity field that links the shoulder of this marmoset to its right wrist. And as you can already see, because so you can see that here the predicted part affinity field nicely links always the shoulder to the wrist in each one of these 2 individuals. And there's no wrong connection from the shoulder of this marmoset to the wrist of this other marmoset. And therefore you can imagine that you can use the vector field cost to correctly assemble that this wrist actually belongs to this shoulder and that this wrist belongs to this shoulder. Okay, so in summary, the deep neural network within DeepLabCut for multi-animal pose estimation, which was introduced in version 2.2 of DeepLabCut, consists of 4 outputs, 2 outputs that correspond to the key point pose estimation, score map, and location refinement, and then this new part for predicting part affinity fields in order to link key points. And then thirdly, a part on identity prediction, which I will discuss in later slides in more detail. And we also changed the architecture in contrast to a standard ResNet, and in particular inspired by an architecture called higher resolution net, which was state-of-the-art on COCO, one of the major benchmarks for human pose estimation. At that time, we changed the normal architecture of a ResNet, which basically is depicted up here in this branch, by adding additional multi-scale branches and then fusing them at the output. That is the multi-fusion part of the network that we call DLC-RNet. And then we also introduced a multi-stage decoder where the output of the backbone is actually upsampled to predict score maps, part affinity fields, and identity features as indicated here. And then this is done multiple times in a recursive fashion in order to create a so-called multi-stage decoder. So that is the basic architecture, network architecture of DeepLabCut. But in DLC 2.2, you can use DLC-RNet or, of course, so other backbones. And you can also combine this multi-stage decoder with other backbones or not use a multi-stage decoder at all. Although we find best results with this architecture that we introduced in this paper. In order to evaluate multi-animal pose estimation algorithms, we also introduced 4 benchmarks that broadly depict challenging data sets from different scenarios in biology. So we considered one data set where 3 mice are in an open field and where 12 body parts are labeled as indicated in this frame to the left. We also considered the data set with 2 marmosets, where 2 marmosets are labeled with 15 key points, and where these 2 marmosets are in one large 3-dimensional cage where they are filmed from above. We also considered one data set of 14 fish, where 5 key points were each annotated. And both the marmoset and the fish data set, they are extremely challenging because a lot of occlusions, because the animals can occlude each other in these scenarios. And then additionally, we introduced one data set, one parenting data set for mice, where there's one adult mouse taking care of 2 pups. And this also made us change the neural network architecture of DeepLabCut so that one can actually simultaneously output key points for an individual that is alone or a single, and key points from multiple individuals. And that allows, for example, the tracking of the multiple pups, which those are treated here as multi-individual and a single animal. Or one could, for example, track multiple mice and how they interact with one object. This is one feature that our design allows us to do. So we introduced those 4 benchmarks to assess multi-animal pose estimation in the laboratory. And I should also briefly introduce the relevant metrics for assessing pose estimation for multiple animals. As we discussed in the lecture yesterday, one of the key metrics for assessing the accuracy of a pose estimation algorithm is RMSE, which measures the mean square error between of the Euclidean distance between the ground truth and the predicted key point, averaged across key points. But as you can imagine, if you have multiple individuals, then the prediction needs to be linked to the correct ground truth in order to measure an RMSE. And RMSE is therefore not fully meaningful in a scenario with multiple individuals. However, when you create your own DeepLabCut model in this scenario, looking at the RMSE for the detections is extremely useful, because you want to make sure that your model predicts enough key points, and that for every ground truth key point, there is at least one prediction that is close enough to your for every individual. However, RMSE is not measuring how well your algorithm would actually group correct key points in one animal, and in other words, assemble the animal correctly. For this, people use a metric called mean average precision, or MAP in short. And MAP is an average of the OKS metric, or object key point similarity, where what one does is one takes the Euclidean distance between, so this is now for the ground truth, for each ground truth individual, we calculate the distance the Euclidean distance between to all the predicted individuals and calculate the OKS similarity, then those are matched so that the closest individual is assigned to each ground truth animal, and then this is averaged into the mean average precision. So MAP is an assembly accuracy, and higher is better. And this is a normalized metric between 0 and 1. As I was saying, so now let's go back to multi-animal DeepLabCut and how accurate this method actually is. As I was alluding to, the key idea is that one doesn't only predict the key points, but the network also predicts skeletons or edges that connect those, or a skeleton is kind of a combination of different part affinity fields that the model is predicting. But as you can imagine, if you were to, for example, predict those key points on the mouse that you can see up here, then there are lots of skeletons that a user could define in order to perform multi-animal pose estimation. And it's maybe not apparent which skeleton is the best one. I should maybe briefly say what features such a skeleton should have. Now, in order to correctly assemble an individual, what you need is that for any pair of two key points on an individual, that there is a connection in the graph of all the part affinity fields, okay? Because in a sequential fashion, those will be linked when we perform assembly in a graph algorithm. Now, the problem for this, what we call here naive skeleton, would be, imagine there was another mouse that jumps over this mouse here. And if it would occlude the back of this mouse, and in particular occlude a bunch of those part affinity fields, then the model wouldn't be able to reliably predict those part affinity fields. And therefore, we would not be able to link, for example, this key point up here close to the shoulder to the tailbase key point of this mouse. So in other words, this is a highly suboptimal skeleton for performing, for grouping the key points of an individual together if animals are closely interacting. And what we have done in order to simplify this process of figuring out what skeleton would be good for a user is we've actually come up with a body plan agnostic graph optimization method where the user doesn't even need to draw the skeleton. All the user needs to do is they need to decide which key point they should track, what they want to track, for example, based on their downstream application. And then DeepLabCut on its own decides which limb should be learned and connected. And this is done in the following way. First, during training, we create a fully connected graph. And so DeepLabCut needs to predict all the part affinity fields for all pairs of key points on an animal. And then at evaluation, there's an additional step where we cross-validate which connections, which part affinity fields actually useful for assembling individuals. And this down here is indeed the optimal skeleton of the same degree as this naive skeleton up here. And you can already see from looking at this that it has a bunch of features that are highly intuitive for robustness. Namely, this skeleton actually has many central points. So rather than kind of serially going through this individual here, they're actually redundant connections where central nodes connect independently directly to key points that are far away. And that is much more robust, as you will see in the evaluation on the next frame. I should also say that if you want to predict a lot of key points, then obviously all the fully connected graph has a lot of edges. In this case, you can also subsample the graph and still achieve good performance, as we show in the supplementary material of the Lau et al. Publication. But now let's go to the quantification. So here we consider, as I initially described, those 4 benchmarking data sets that we have developed together with our collaborators. And we considered our novel data-driven method, and we compared our methods to a state-of-the-art method called higher HRNet, which you can see here in kind of violet color. And higher HRNet is a state-of-the-art multi-individual method on COCO, one of the leading benchmarks for human pose estimation. And what you see on the x-axis, and this algorithm does not depend on the graph size, by the way, so it doesn't change over the graph size on the x-axis. So on the x-axis, we see the graph size, and on the y-axis, we see MAP, where higher is better. And so first, we show the performance of naive skeletons. So baseline is Multianimal DLC version 2.2, where one would naively draw the skeletons. And you can see, as expected for morphologies of the mouse, for example, and the marmoset, where the key points are not arranged in a line, where one can actually create interesting skeletons, one gets better performance if one uses more connections. This intuitively makes sense, because if one has more connections, then the assembly of the individual is more likely to be correct. But importantly, with our novel data-driven method, even if we have the smallest number of nodes of edges in our graph, we already achieve as high performance as for the baseline method. And that, of course, has the advantage that because during assembly, we also have a smaller graph, the assembly process is computationally easier and faster during inference. So overall, what we see in this key graph is that DLC 2.2 achieves, with this data-driven body agnostic method, achieves really good performance on those 4 benchmarking data sets. And I should also say that the performance perhaps on the extremely challenging fish data set is not as high as one would maybe like it to be. And we are very actively working on improving this performance, especially on such challenging crowded scenes. And next, I very briefly wanted to talk about individual animal identification, which is extremely important for multi-animal pose estimation. So, as you know, one can broadly kind of group animals into 2 types. Some animals that have textured patterns, where those textures are indicative of the individual, like in the example of tigers or zebras or zebrafish, and animals that do not have kind of textures that are specific to individuals. And here they're bears, for example, or mice, or also humans. And if you and what you can see in the case of tigers, for example, here's one individual in 3 different settings. You can see that it's much easier for us even to say that this is actually the same individual. But in the case of brown bears, that's a data set that we work on, it is actually very hard to, even for experts, to tell that this here is actually the same individual. Individual animal identification is an important computer vision task. And just like for pose estimation, people use deep neural networks to first, from the sensor data, localize individuals, or localize them in space. And then one uses this bounding box information and feeds that into a deep neural network to get higher order features. And then this can be used to classify individuals. So this is a setting where one uses supervised learning, or to actually perform metric learning, where one trains this neural network to learn a latent representation, such that when one samples one individual, so what one does during training is you would sample a so-called anchor individual, like let's say this guy, and then you would take a different image from the same individual from your training set, let's say this one. And obviously we know that this is the same individual. So we want to make sure that in our latent embedding, this same individual is as closely as possible embedded as the anchor individual. And we will also sample a negative individual, for example, this one. And we want to make sure that that this distance is as large as possible and this one is as small as possible. And this is a so-called metric learning approach, where one can learn an embedding that then can be used to perform individual identification. So this is something that we described in a review from last year, where we talked about different methods for animal identification. And in DeepLabCut 2.2, we integrated actually both types of identification methods, namely classification and metric learning, as I will show you next. So firstly, we actually didn't use an additional neural network to do identification, but actually we added another output down here, which allows one to predict the identity of each individual. And so specifically in the case of the marmosets, we actually had a setting where the marmosets are labeled. Keep in mind, animals could be labeled by their natural texture or artificially labeled, as in this case, where the tufts of one marmoset is always dyed in a blue color. And in fact, this is consistently done in this data from Guoping Feng's lab at MIT in their cages, so that in each cage, there are always two marmosets. One has blue dyed tufts and the other one has white, has undyed tufts. And the model is trained to predict the identity of the key points already. And what we saw in our paper is that DeepLabCut can very accurately predict the identity of individual key points, whether they are key points of the blue marmoset or the white marmoset, so to speak. And we can see that the model actually for key points that are closer to the dyed tufts, this is much more accurate. Around 99% accuracy is what the model achieves. But even for key points that are very distal from the head, like the right leg, the model can tell with 95% accuracy that this body part belongs to a blue dyed marmoset. And so this identification, or this built-in identification head, is going to be extremely important for tracking animals, as I will show you in a second. So far I've talked about localization and then also assembly based on part affinity fields. But overall, of course, for doing multi-animal pose tracking, we also need a tracking step, and that's what we're going to discuss next. So let's consider the case that we have two mice depicted here as yellow ones and black ones, and we have tracked these mice up to time t. So we know that these three are actually the same, and these three is the same across time. And now we get two new detections. Of course, a priori, it's not clear what this new detection in this new frame t, if it actually is related to this one or to this one. And so what we do in DeepLabCut is we forward predict for each one of the past tracked mice the most likely location. So here would be the most likely location for this yellow tracklet, and here would be the most likely location for the black tracklet. And then we compare and associate the new detections to the forward predicted one that is most close. Okay, so in other words, here we would then say, obviously at time t, this guy actually belongs to this sequence of mice, and this guy belongs to this sequence of mice. So this is a local tracking algorithm that allows you to kind of predict individuals, to kind of link poses across frame and perform tracking. But of course, so what this does, in other words, is it creates temporally linked sequences of poses, and we call those tracklets. Okay, and also people in the field call these tracklets. So now keep in mind that this is not the complete solution to the tracking problem, because a priori, let's say we have these two trajectories of two mice depicted here in blue and in gray, and then here in this case, there are, of course, 2 time points where they come very closely together. And obviously, these time points are extremely challenging for a local tracking algorithm. And what a local tracking algorithm depicted down here would most likely give you here is actually different tracklets that will be interrupted exactly at the times when the animals get extremely close to each other. Because in this case, it's no longer trivial to kind of link across frames which animal is the same one. Okay. So in other words, from this local tracking algorithm, we get different tracklets. And in order to perform tracking for a complete video, we do something that we call global stitching. And by doing so, what we're actually doing is we treat the tracking problem of tracking two individuals across a whole video. We kind of tackle it in a divide and conquer fashion, where we make this problem simpler computationally by first performing local tracking based on what I just had told you, that we basically forward predict the detections and then link those accordingly across time. And in fact, the way this is normally done in pedestrian tracking, for example, is based on so-called bounding boxes that contain the pedestrian or the animal. And we have found in our paper that bounding boxes are a bad parameterization of animals due to their shapes. You can see that in a second for mice and also for fish. And we have introduced an additional parameter that is the orientation, and actually fit an ellipse to the bounding boxes. And we did the local tracking based on ellipse tracking, in other words. So for local tracking, there are also additional parameters that you need, namely the number of minimum hits frames and the maximum age of when kind of a tracklet disappears if there are no detections. These are two parameters you can explore in the afternoon, the practical session. But now, for the sake of the argument here now, let's think back to this case. We have these local tracklets like this, and we want to create the optimal track for our individuals. Now, of course, this here in this discussion, I assume that none of the animals are actually leaving the scene and then coming back, which is also something you can deal with in DeepLabCut. But what we now do in DeepLabCut in order to deal with these tracklets is we perform global reasoning. And so here, what we do is we say, well, we can think of, so at each juncture where this tracklet ends, and then, for example, these two other ones begin, we can introduce a cost of linking this orange tracklet to the green one or to the yellow one. So this would be the costs that we estimate, and I will discuss the costs in a second. And in this way, we can actually turn our tracklets into a graph where each node corresponds to a tracklet, and each link corresponds to the cost of linking two tracklets together. Notice that not every node is connected to every other node, because, for example, this orange tracklet could only be linked to yellow and green. So this is actually a somewhat sparse graph, which is good for solving, for kind of finding the optimal links in this graph. Now, how do we define the costs? So for this, one can pick different metrics, and I will show you the performance of those different metrics later. But essentially, one can, for example, consider whether the Euclidean distance between the end of a tracklet and the beginning of a new tracklet is as close as possible. One can also take motion into account with Hanklets. One can look at the unidirected Hausdorff distance between the beginning and the end of another tracklet. And one can also look at kind of how closely the poses align at the end and the beginning of a new tracklet. And importantly, so these are all related to posture and movement. But importantly, one can also take the identity of the individual into account. And so here for identity, we really mean how higher order features that are extracted and that describe the identity, as we had seen it, for example, in the supervised case for the monkeys. But I will later also discuss an unsupervised way to do identification, like learning the costs of identification based on metric learning. Okay, so now this is the approach that we have in DeepLabCut for doing tracking. And as a reminder, this is a local and global approach that we kind of developed in order to break this problem down in a divide and conquer fashion. So what we then did is we also, for the different data sets, we created some ground truth annotations that you can see here. And we used those to measure the accuracy of DeepLabCut. The metric for measuring tracking accuracy I will introduce in the next slide, but already down here, I want to show the performance of DeepLabCut. So here's the performance for DLC RNet with a certain tracker. And you can see that the algorithm can very closely actually match up the ground truth for the 3 mice and also for the pups. And then for the fish, there are naturally some flips because it's an extremely challenging tracking problem. And also for the marmosets, there are a few errors. But those errors, if you have them in your video, they can actually be corrected in a dedicated graphical user interface where you can look at the tracks and fix them if necessary, if there's a swap. So how does one assess the multi-object tracking accuracy of an algorithm? So there's a metric that is literally called that and is called MOTA for short. And MOTA is an accuracy. So again, it's between 0 and 1. Higher is better. And MOTA essentially accounts for all errors from trackers, namely false positives, misses, mismatches, and sums those over all the frames and then normalizes it by the number of frames, which is why it's normalized. So let's look at the quantitative results of DeepLabCut. So here we have the results for the 4 different data sets. And we can see that, so the gray part is concerned with the local trackers. So here we see that for the mice, we already with the local trackers achieve very high accuracy of MOTA, very close to 1, both for the box and for the ellipse. For the pups and for the fish and for the marmosets, we indeed see that a box local tracker is much worse than an ellipse local tracker. And generally, because ellipses are just better for kind of parameterizing the shape of animals, this is also the default in DeepLabCut. So these gray dots indicate kind of the performance of the local trackers. And then we can also improve this performance further by using global reasoning. And in particular, this can be best seen if we actually look at especially the marmosets and the fish, where tracking is extremely challenging, versus for the other 2 data sets for which local trackers are almost perfect already. And we can see for the marmoset and for the fish that by using stitching, we can reduce the errors quite substantially. There's still some remaining errors. So for such a data set that is as challenging as this, you always need to visually kind of verify if the tracking is correct. And interesting or importantly, especially for the marmoset, where we also have supervised ID information in the form of because these are marked animals, we see that with using the identity cost for global reasoning, we can further reduce the tracking error quite substantially. So I kind of pull up this slide as a reminder. So if you work with an animal for which it is naturally kind of labeled, then you can use this information in a supervised fashion. But even if your animal is not, even if you don't have ground truth annotation on the identity, then in DeepLabCut you can make use of individual ID information. And I will explain how we do this now. So here the starting point is again tracklets. Okay. And of course it's cheap to get tracklets because you can just get them based on local tracking. And we have developed a re-identification method based on metric learning, where we use a transformer, which is a deep neural network architecture that comes actually from natural language processing and is very powerful. And we use this transformer based on the raw features, the raw pose features that we extract from the trained DLC backbone. So in other words, we would, for example, take, and we trained this in metric learning, just in the way that I had described it here. So for each batch, we sample an anchor and a positive pair, as well as a negative pair. And so in our setting here, for tracklets, the way we do this is we sample an anchor, for example, from this blue tracklet, and then a positive pair from the same tracklet, and a negative pair from either a tracklet that happened at the same time, from another, which presumably means it's another individual, or at a much later time. In fact, no, we don't do it from a later time, only at the same time, because otherwise we wouldn't be sure that it's actually a different individual. And so we sample triplets in this way, and then the transformer has to learn to kind of minimize this triplet loss. And here's what we find with this. So here we evaluate how accurately the re-ID transformer, as we call this module, is actually able at identifying whether two marmosets or two fish or two mice are the same. So crucially for marmosets, we find that we can do this with more than 98% accuracy. Even for the mice, we can do this with extremely high accuracy. And also for the fish, we can do this with more than 90% accuracy. Notice that this is all accuracy within a relatively short video of this tracklet. And so this is on the ground truth data set. And you can also do this on the local tracks, where you actually overestimate your identification performance, because it's also much easier to estimate it because tracklets are relatively short. But still, this kind of is a proof of principle that this re-ID transformer can learn an embedding that is indicative of the identity of these individuals. And we then showed that if we indeed compare, for example, the performance of DLC RNet with baseline tracking to a re-ID transformer, we can boost the MOTA score. So in other words, this tracking is really, or unsupervised re-identification can really be used for boosting tracking performance. I'm coming to the end of this talk, but I really want to drive home why re-identification methods are essential for doing pose estimation or pose tracking in long-term scenarios. So here is an example video actually from our paper where we predict the poses of these two marmosets. And now I'm showing you the same data, but I show the X and Y coordinates of the center of the body of these two marmosets over time. And I've not depicted them by individual. And if you look at this data, it actually looks relatively complex. And you can imagine that that it's actually hard to keep track of who is who here, even based on these trajectories. And so if I color it for you, you can see that, let's say there's this red marmoset across time and the blue marmoset across time. And this corresponds to kind of the same figure of like a tracklet figure. Then there are naturally points where these two marmosets in XY get close together, like here and here in this case, or in this actual case, there would be these 5 moments where the marmosets get very close. And if you now perform ID-based temporal local tracking, so where what you do is you take kind of at those time points where they get really close at the time of the tracklet, when what you would do is you compare if the identity of the marmoset here is more similar to the identity embedding of the marmoset here, then because because obviously they are highly occluding each other, is actually highly non-trivial to identify each individual, you will naturally make some errors. And here is, in fact, an example prediction when we use ID-based temporal local tracking. And if you directly overload these plots, then you see that there would be a substantial amount of this video where we actually wrongly predict the identity of the marmoset. So this is temporal tracking. But we can, of course, do better, because I was indicating already earlier that that we are actually able to predict the identity of a marmoset on a single frame, especially when they're not close to each other, with extremely high accuracy. And therefore, what makes much more sense than basically propagating the identity across your video in a temporal fashion, where you can flip the IDs and then not recover that, because there's no recovery mechanism. You could actually perform re-ID based tracking, where you track based on identity information, in which case you will only have, you can have some flips when animals are extremely close, but you will never have a flip from, let's say, the beginning of a video to an end. And so this is really crucial if you want to analyze social behavior over long time scales. And just as a small kind of appetizer of day 4 of this course, where we will talk more about unsupervised behavioral analysis, I wanted to show the last figure of the Lau et al. Nature Methods paper, where we actually looked at 9 hours of continuous recording of marmosets. Here you see the trajectories of 2 marmosets. Here's the egocentric postures. You can then, for example, perform PCA and see that they have different postural dynamics that they typically carry out, like have, for example, extended body, extended limb configurations, and so on. And I think the most interesting result that we actually had in this paper regarding the marmoset behavior was that marmosets really like to look at in the same directions when they're together. So indicative of the fact that they're highly social animals. So in closing, I want to give you a sneak peek of DeepLabCut version 2.4. So 2.3 is actually a version that contains a new GUI that is really exciting and that you should try out. And in 2.4, we introduce new architectures that tackle highly crowded social interactions. And here I want to show you, here I'm showing you challenging test frames from CrowdPose, benchmark for human pose estimation in crowds. And you see that, for example, one of the current state-of-the-art method called MIPNet has problems, especially kind of in this jump situation here, where the leg is wrongly predicted, or for these people that sit all together on the same motorcycle. And here's the performance of our new DeepLabCut 2.4, which we will release hopefully very soon, and that we're currently integrating. And these are, of course, just examples, but in our paper, we benchmark DLC 2.4 rigorously in this new architecture, and we achieve state-of-the-art performance on CrowdPose by quite a margin, actually. And we also could improve the pose estimation accuracy on highly crowded social animal data sets, which I think is of great importance for the field. So with that, I'm coming to the conclusions. I talked about bottom-up and top-down approaches that I use for multi-animal pose estimation. I talked about the architectural design and the graph pruning algorithm that we have introduced in DLC 2.2. I've talked about also how tracking is done in social scenarios, and how DeepLabCut integrates re-identification of individual methods, of individuals, both with supervised and unsupervised fashions. And I want to thank our collaborators on this project, especially the first author, Jesse Lauer, and then also Xiaokai and Mu, who worked on this paper with Mackenzie Mathis as well. And of course, I want to thank all the experimental collaborators, in particular Catherine Dulac, Gulping Feng, Venkatesh Murthy, and Valentina Di Santo and George Lauder from the US. And I want to thank you for your attention.